spoke of increased pay, of a neck chain, a crown, and other military gifts, while Arminius jeered at such paltry recompense for slavery. Then began a controversy. The one spoke of the greatness of Rome, the resources of Caesar, the dreadful punishment in store for the vanquished, the ready mercy for him who surrenders, and the fact that neither Arminius's wife nor his son were treated as enemies. The other of the claims of fatherland, of ancestral freedom, of the gods of the homes of Germany, of the mother who shared his prayers, that Flavius might not choose to be the deserter and betrayer rather than the ruler of his kinfolk and relatives, and indeed of his own people. By degrees they fell into bitter words, and even the river between them would not have hindered them from joining combat, had not Stertinius hurried up and put his hand on Flavius, who in the full tide of his fury was demanding his weapons and his charger. Arminius was seen facing him, full of menaces and challenging him to conflict. Much of what he said was in Roman speech, for he had served in our camp as leader of his fellow countrymen. Next day the German army took up its position on the other side of the Visurgis. Caesar, thinking that without bridges and troops to guard them it would not be good generalship to expose the legions to danger, sent the cavalry across the river by the fords. It was commanded by Stertinius and Emilius, one of the first-rank centurions, who had attacked at widely different points so as to distract the enemy. Chariovalda, the Batavian chief, dashed into the charge where the stream is most rapid. The Cherusei, by a pretended flight, drew him into a plain surrounded by forest passes. Then, bursting on him in a sudden attack from all points, they thrust aside all who resisted, pressed fiercely on their retreat, driving them before them. When they rallied in a compact array, some by close fighting, others by missiles from a distance, Chariovalda, after long sustaining the enemy's fury, cheered on his men to break by a dense formation the onset of their bands, while he himself, plunged into the thickest of the battle, fell amid a shower of darts with his horse pierced under him, and round him many noble chiefs. The rest were rescued from the peril by their own strength, or by the cavalry which came up with Stertinius and Emilius. Caesar, on crossing the Visurgis, learnt by the information of a deserter that Arminius had chosen a battlefield, that other tribes too had assembled in a forest sacred to Hercules, and would venture on a night attack on his camp. He put faith in this intelligence, and besides, several watchfires were seen. Scouts also, who had crept close up to the enemy, reported that they had heard the neighing of horses and the hum of a huge and tumultuous host. And so, as the decisive crisis drew near, that he ought thoroughly to sound the temper of his soldiers. He considered with himself how this was to be accomplished with a genuine result. Tribunes and centurions, he knew, oftener reported what was welcome than what was true. Freedmen had slavish spirits, friends a love of flattery. If an assembly were called, there too the lead of a few was followed by the shout of the many. He must probe their innermost thoughts, when they were uttering their hopes and fears at the military mess, among themselves and unwatched. At nightfall, leaving his tent of augury by a secret exit unknown to the sentries, with one companion, his shoulders covered with a wild beast skin, he visited the camp streets, stood by the tents, and enjoyed the men's talk about himself. As one extolled his noble rank, another his handsome person, nearly all of them his endurance, his gracious manner, and the evenness of his temper, whether he was jesting or was serious, while they acknowledged that they ought to repay him with their gratitude in battle, and at the same time sacrifice to a glorious vengeance the perfidious violators of peace. Meanwhile one of the enemy, acquainted with the Roman tongue, spurred his horse up to the entrenchments, and in a loud voice promised in the name of Arminius to all deserters, wives and lands, with daily pay of 100 sesterces as long as the war lasted. The insult fired the wrath of the legions. Let daylight come, they said, let battle be given. The soldiers will possess themselves of the lands of the Germans, and will carry off their wives. We hail the omen. We mean the women and the riches of the enemy to be our spoil. About midday there was a skirmishing attack upon our camp, without any discharge of missiles, when they saw the cohorts in close array before the lines and no sign of carelessness. The same night brought with it a cheering dream to Germanicus. He saw himself engaged in sacrifice, and his robe being sprinkled with the sacred blood. Another more beautiful was given him by the hands of his grandmother Augusta. Encouraged by the omen, and finding the auspices favorable, he called an assembly, and explained the precautions which wisdom suggested as suitable for the impending battle. It is not, he said, plains only which are good for the fighting of Roman soldiers, but woods and forest passes if science be used. For the huge shields and unwieldy lances of the barbarians cannot, amid trunks of trees and brushwood that springs from the ground, be so well managed as our javelins and swords and close-fitting armor. Shower your blows thickly, strike at the face with your sword's points. The German has neither cuirass nor helmet. Even his shield is not strengthened with leather or steel, but is of osiers woven together, or of thin and painted board. If their first line is armed with spears, the rest have only weapons hardened by fire or very short. Again, though their frames are terrible to the eye, and formidable in a brief onset, they have no capacity of enduring wounds. Without any shame at the disgrace, without any regard to their leaders, they quit the field and flee. They quail under disaster, just as in success they forget alike divine and human laws. If in your weariness of land and sea you desire an end of service, this battle prepares the way to it. The Elbe is now nearer than the Rhine, and there is no war beyond, provided only you enable me, keeping close as I do to my father's and uncle's footsteps, to stand a conqueror on the same spot. The general's speech was followed by enthusiasm in the soldiers, and the signal for battle was given. Nor were Arminius and the other German chiefs slow to call their respective clansmen to witness that these Romans were the most cowardly fugitives out of Varius's army, men who rather than endure war had taken to mutiny. Half of them have their backs covered with wounds, half are once again exposing limbs battered by waves and storms to a foe full of fury, and to hostile deities, with no hope of advantage. They have, in fact, had recourse to a fleet and to a trackless ocean, that their coming might be unopposed, their flight unpursued. But when once they have joined conflict with us, the help of winds or oars will be unavailing to the vanquished. Remember only their greed, their cruelty, their pride. Is anything left for us but to retain our freedom, or to die before we are enslaved? When they were thus roused and were demanding battle, their chiefs led them down to a plain named Idistavisus. It winds between the Visurgis and a hill range, its breadth varying as the river banks recede or the spurs of the hills project on it. In their rear rose a forest, with the branches rising to a great height, while there were clear spaces between the trunks. The barbarian army occupied the plain and the outskirts of the wood. The Cherusei were posted by themselves on the high ground, so as to rush down on the Romans during the battle. Our army advanced in the following order. The auxiliary Gauls and Germans were in the van, then the foot archers after them, 4 legions and Caesar himself with 2 Praetorian cohorts, and some picked cavalry. Next came as many other legions, and light-armed troops with horse bowmen, and the remaining cohorts of the allies. The men were quite ready and prepared to form in line of battle according to their marching order. Caesar, as soon as he saw the Cherusian bands, which in their impetuous spirit had rushed to the attack, ordered the finest of his cavalry to charge them in flank, Stertinius with the other squadrons to make a detour and fall on their rear, promising himself to come up in good time. Meanwhile there was a most encouraging augury. 8 eagles, seen to fly towards the woods and enter them, caught the general's eye. "Go," he exclaimed, "follow the Roman birds, the true deities of our legions." At the same moment the infantry charged, and the cavalry, which had been sent on in advance, dashed on the rear and the flanks, and, strange to relate, 2 columns of the enemy fled in opposite directions, that which had occupied the wood rushing into the open, those who had been drawn up on the plain into the wood. The Cherusei, who were between them, were dislodged from the hills, while Arminius, conspicuous among them by gesture, voice, and a wound he had received, kept up the fight. He had thrown himself on our archers, and was on the point of breaking through them, when the cohorts of the Reti, Vendelici, and Gauls faced his attack. By a strong bodily effort, however, and a furious rush of his horse, he made his way through them, having smeared his face with his blood that he might not be known. Some have said that he was recognized by the Chauci serving among the Roman auxiliaries, who let him go. And Geomeris owed his escape to similar courage or treachery. The rest were cut down in every direction. Many, in attempting to swim across the Visurgis, were overwhelmed under a storm of missiles, or by the force of the current. Lastly, by the rush of fugitives and the falling in of the banks. Some in their ignominious flight climbed the tops of trees, and as they were hiding themselves in the boughs, archers were brought up and they were shot for sport. Others were dashed to the ground by the felling of the trees. It was a great victory, and without bloodshed to us. From 9 in the morning to nightfall the enemy were slaughtered. and 10 miles were covered with arms and dead bodies, while there were found